Okay. Hey everyone. Welcome to the lecture video for Race, Crime, and Justice. This is week 3. In particular, we are talking about race and criminal behavior this week. Again, this is looking at chapter 3 of the textbook. Each lecture covers one chapter from the textbook, and then there will be additional readings on Blackboard. Um, yeah. Anyway, so race and criminal behavior. So, just to start off, those of you who are from and have taken several criminal justice classes with us already, a lot of the information, or rather the where data comes from and things like that, should be mostly review. But those of you who are not CJ majors and haven't really taken that many CJ classes, this might all be new stuff to you. So we are going to talk about some of these things. For those of you who are criminal justice majors, I will be going over what they are again. For those of you that aren't, you're going to learn something about criminal justice here today. But in general, it's going to be a little bit different. There's a lot of data from this particular chapter, and we're just going to kind of go through that and talk about it in broader senses and things like that. So, our text itself, we've been talking about it this entire time. We've been building up to this, and it's funny because it's only chapter 3, and we've been building up towards it. There is a disparity in crime data and representation within the criminal justice system. And so we know it's there, but how do we know it's there? What is our evidence? And so if you're from social work, from sociology, psychology, philosophy, if you're from those areas, you should be familiar somewhat with, research, social science data, things like that. So we do have surveys and survey material and data like that uh, we use in criminal justice. And really, there are three key places where we get our evidence, and that is the Uniform Crime Report, the National Crime Victim Survey, and several self reporting data studies. So, in particular, we're not going to point out any one self reporting data study. There are several different ones. Oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank on the name right now, but something the future uh, is one. There's a lot of different self-reporting data, but we'll be talking about that kind of stuff. So, real quick, the Uniform Crime Report, again, for those of you who are not criminal justice people, the Uniform Crime Report, or UCR as it's just referred to, is a collection of arrest data that is, or rather, not even arrest, but reported crimes from as many jurisdictions, police departments, etc., from across the country that is compiled by the FBI. This is the FBI's Uniform Crime Report. It takes all the data from all of the individual criminal justice facilities from across the United States and takes their crime reported data and compiles it to give us national averages. Um, Obviously, there's an issue with this. The issue is that it's only reported crimes. That's one of the big ones. But there's also another issue that we don't often talk about. I believe it's talked briefly about in Intro to Criminal Justice. Oddly enough, I teach it, and I'm not sure that I do or not, but if I haven't, you're learning that here too. Another issue with the Uniform Crime Report is that not every criminal justice facility in every state, everywhere, sends in their data. Some of them don't report the data. Sometimes they're late with the data. Sometimes they're missing data. There are a lot of potential issues with it. But the biggest issue and the main reason why we use more than one survey tool and data gathering tool is the fact that it requires reported crimes. So this is another one of those. If you're not criminal justice, you may not know this. There's something called the dark figure of crime within the criminal justice field, and that is the idea that over 50% of crimes go unreported. So the data we have to work with by the Uniform Crime Report represents realistically less than 50% of all crimes committed. And so we see a severe lack of data. We have an issue here. And so the response of how do we find that missing data? Well, we incorporate the National Crime Victim Survey. This is recently there's been several different ones. There's been incident-based surveys, things like that. But these are also compiled by the FBI and through that. But this particular piece, the National Crime Victim Survey, doesn't matter if they were reported crimes or not. In particular, the National Crime Victim Survey, if someone has claimed to be a victim of a crime, whether it was reported to a police officer, so that would be under the crime report, or if it was to a hospital or mental health, things like that, there's this National Crime Victim Survey. And so this data compiles information from victims of criminal action. So the Uniform Crime Report is criminal rates based off of people who have been charged or at least a reported crime. Crime Victim Survey is from the victim's standpoint. And then we have our third and final evidence-based collecting data, which is self-reported data. And so, as I said, a lot of the self-reporting data, and I believe I actually mentioned it on a slide here, but self-reporting data tends to be focused on juvenile delinquency, and we'll get more into it when we get to that section. But the self-reporting data does have value because it is it is individuals claiming ownership over what crimes they have committed, and that's partly why I say it's juvenile, because it's not necessarily going to a home address. It's performed in schools and of that nature. Anyway, so we're gonna talk about that stuff. So, just a little bit of stuff to talk about. In general, there are two types of offenses that the UCR breaks down, as well as what we talk about throughout the chapter. And that is Part 1 offenses and Part 2 offenses. Part 1 offenses include violent crimes and property crimes. Violent crimes are homicide, aggravated assault, sexual assault, robbery, things of that nature. Property crimes are burglary, robbery, motor vehicle theft, arson, things of that nature. Those are Part 1 offenses, whereas Part 2 offenses are things like public drunkenness, drug possession, prostitution, vandalism. They're all offenses, but you can already see, again, criminal justice term, the crimes are graded to a certain level. Part 1 offenses are obviously more serious. Part 2 are lesser. So that's just important to note. But some of the data we're going to look at, we need to look at the percentages of populations arrested versus the total population, as well as the arrest rate per 100,000 for each group. And the reason for that particular kind of breakdown is that's how we get a better understanding and idea of just how the statistics work and how we can accurately represent. I was trying to think of how I wanted to phrase this. Accurately represent the data itself. So, if you want to follow along with me as I'm talking about this stuff, I'm going to reference tables and data from the book itself. So, I'm starting right now with page 48, just so that you're aware. Table 3.1, we're going to be talking about the data from that table, as well as some of the stuff that was mentioned at the bottom of page 47, I believe. Yes. Under the race and arrest crime, or race and arrest paragraph section. So, in particular, the data from the 2016 UCR. So this would be data that was collected all across 2016 because it was posted in 2017. But this is the Uniform Crime Reports data. In 2016, there was 515,000 violent crimes committed. About 1.4 million property crimes. And so these are the two parts that are Part 1 offenses. And then there was around 6 million Part 2 offenses. These are the lesser crimes. Roughly 8.4 million offenses total across the board. And this includes juvenile crime data and adult crime data. So 2016, 8.4 million offenses total that happened. And according to that data as well, African Americans made up 13% of the total population in 2016. Let that sink in for a second. Total population of the United States, 13% of that population was African American. Now, according to the data from the UCR for 2016, African Americans, who make up 13% of the population, were arrested for violent crimes 37.5% of the time. For property crime, they committed 28.1% of all property crimes. And of all offenses, remember that big 8.4 million offenses, African Americans, made up a total of 26.9% of all offenses. Now, yes, white crime, we do see 69.6% for all offenses, but there is an asterisk when it comes to the book uses Latino, but I use Latinx because that is the accepted term as of now for the Latin community, and so I'm going to recognize that. But the Latinx and the white group number is problematic for the UCR, and that's because different jurisdictions classify those differently. In some locations, they have white non-Latinx and just white. And so in some places there's not a distinction for Latinx, and in some places there are. So the data itself, when you try to accommodate for that kind of information, the Latinx and the white statistics are potentially skewed. It's just an important note to say that while, yes, this data might be accurate or it might be a close number, it could be skewed one way or another depending on particular jurisdictions and how things were reported. So it's important to understand that. But what's the takeaway that I'm trying to get here is that 13% of the population, and as we've said before, even though it's 13% of the population, it's a small percentage of that population that actually commits the crime. So if we're being really generous and say a whole percent of that 13%, 1% of the population is committing almost 27% of all crime. That should immediately send up some red flags. That's a lot of crime being committed by a small group. So there is an issue. And so on page 49, we get the actual breakdown with the Census Bureau data from 2016. So we get, and I quote, African Americans, there was 5,393 arrests per 100,000 population. So for every 100,000 people who are African American, there were 5,393 arrests, according to the data, how you break it down. Of the Asian population, 547 per 100,000. Latinx, 2,122 per 100,000. Native Americans, 4,268 arrests per 100,000 individuals. And if we look at the data that they have, they make up 2% of the total arrests. That is a significantly high number of population and arrests for a small percentage. And we'll talk about that briefly in a moment. And then whites, 2,386 per 100,000. And that is for all offenses. When we look at just violent crimes, we see that African Americans' arrest rate is 365 arrests per 100,000 people. The next highest is Native Americans at 184 arrests per 100,000 people. That's more than double that. That is a significantly higher rate of African Americans that are being arrested for violent crimes and for crimes in general than any other group. And as I said, the Native American group is equally as high and disproportionate as African American, which of course leads a lot of people to ask the question, why? It is complicated and difficult to talk about, but a lot of the way Native Americans were treated throughout history has led to a bigger factor that we're actually going to talk about today that has led to an increase in criminal activity and why they are very highly saturated regarding percentage-wise of being involved with this. But so, yeah, as I kind of said, what we see from this data, and that's why I said being generous for giving 1%. On page 50, we get the rate that we get of the 100,000 population of all ages and everything for African Americans. Equivalent is 0.4%. So that means 99.6% of African Americans were not arrested for violent crimes in 2016. And if we bring it down to just 18 and older, it's 0.49% of the African American population committed a crime. That is such a small percentage, and yet we see such an oversaturation of African Americans committing crime. Why? What the heck is going on? All right. So I'm not going to go as in depth on the National Crime Victimization Survey, only because the data pretty much supports what we already know, and that's kind of what I want to get down to. So the National Crime Victimization Survey, like I've said before, addresses the victim from their perspective, and what we know about crime is that typically there is some kind of connection to it. So a victim tends to accurately identify their own offender and things of that nature. So what we see in general is that the data from victims coincides fairly nicely with the UCR reports. So we see similar data. We see that roughly the percentage of African Americans who are charged with violent crimes. So the book on page 52, table 3.2, is using National Crime Victimization Survey and Uniform Crime Report data from 2010. All violent crimes, we see that 33% of data from the NCVS showed that African Americans were being recognized by the victim as being the one who did the offense. So they were 33% of all violent crimes were being committed by African Americans according to victim survey data. And when it comes to the Uniform Crime Report arrest data for 2010, showed that all violent crimes, African Americans made up about 31.9 or 32% of all crime. So that's pretty close to 33%. So really what we get from that is that the National Crime Victimization Survey tends to show that the data is accurate, which anyone who wants to be like, but that's not what I know or that's not what I believe. This is the weird reality of statistics and data, and we're going to talk about some of the deeper implications here in just a few minutes. But it's important to note that the data and using evidence-based practice means that we look at this and go, okay, we have arrest data that shows that disproportionately high percentage of African American and Native American is being represented in crime data. And victimization data is showing that African American is committing this crime at a higher rate. That's already dangerous and worrying. So now we have to look at self-reporting data. And so, as I said, there's typically juvenile self-reporting survey data, just simply because it's a population that's easier to access regarding this. It's usually to understand delinquency rates better. These are things that, go all the way from, depending on the place it's done, serious crimes like robbery, assault, things like that, to petty crimes. And the data itself is not the most important thing. The most important thing is that there were 4 key findings from a lot of these self-reporting data that unfortunately seems to confirm a potential stereotype, and that's something that we're going to get into. So the 4 key findings are, number 1, African Americans and Latinx individuals are more likely to commit serious violent and property crimes. The data shows this. This is both self-reporting data. This supports the belief from the NCVS as well as the UCR. So we're seeing that African Americans and Latinx individuals are more likely to commit serious violent, and property crimes. The second piece that is the key finding is around 5 to 6% of all youths of color commit the most serious crimes. This confirms what we already knew, that it's a small percentage of the overall population that is continually reoffending, recommitting crimes. So, small percentage committing the crimes. Number 3, few to no racial differences exist in drug use and other less serious offenses. So, this is one stereotype that is very, very wrong. What we're saying is statistically there is no difference in drug use and less serious offenses across the board, no matter what your race is. So the ever racist ideology that an individual of color is more likely to be involved in drugs, our self-reporting data shows us that, not true. And then the last key finding is that racial differences in serious offending from self-reporting data is smaller than arrest data for juveniles. So we're seeing that while, yes, this is supporting these claims, it's also showing us that the data itself is not as much as the arrest data for juveniles, which shows us that maybe we're overrepresenting juvenile delinquency in these crime statistics, which, again, debatable. So one issue with self-reporting data and data collection for this in particular is the fact that, technically speaking, some people may be making up crime to maybe have, some kind of false street cred. Others might not be reporting their data because they don't want to be in trouble for committing a crime. So self-reporting data does have the issue of how reliable is it, but that is a larger it's a larger issue of survey collection and data collection. And as I said, if you're from sociology, social work, psychology, philosophy, you're familiar with that issue. But yeah, so those are the 4 key findings of self-reporting data. So again, our 3 main collection methods for data in the United States in criminal justice field is self-reporting data, the National Crime Victimization Survey, and the Uniform Crime Report through the FBI. So with all that being said, what do we do with this information? How do we explain the data that we have? Because if you've been following along, you're definitely going to be like, wait a second, but how can this be? How can we have this disparity, this over or underrepresentation in particular groups, but the data says that it's true? So before we dive into that, it's just important to note that across the board, I talk about it in a different class that I'm teaching right now in Intro to Corrections, but there is not data that shows that illegal immigrants or immigrants in general commit crime more often than citizens. It's a common misconception. It's related to our general idea that we talked about last week with public perception and things of that nature. But it is also closely related to racial prejudice and stereotypes. But I wanted to at least mention that briefly because our text does mention it before I go into how the heck do we explain this? How do we explain the difference in criminal behavior based on race? And so I went with the key things from the book, and we're just going to talk about this. So reject racist explanations. And this is one of those, it seems really obvious, and I don't know why I have to say it, but okay. So there is, we kind of talked about it before, that we look for our things that agree with us or things that support our previous understandings or beliefs. So when we see data that says African Americans commit more violent crimes than non-African Americans, of course there are people who are racist that are going to say it proves it. That it is how their culture is. It's how they're raised. That's not understanding it. That is taking the racist explanation, saying, "Yep, proved it." No, it's really difficult to do, but it's very common sense. We have to reject the obvious, easy answer, the racist explanation as to why these things happen. So it can't be that, oh, well, this group is known for this crime. No, stop that. Don't do that. To quote one of my favorite memes, stop it. Get some help. The first step in any of this, and I would argue the first step in creating a better world and becoming a better society, is to reject racist explanations and reject racism as a whole. Don't deny it exists, but reject it. Say, yeah, that's racist. Not going to pretend it's not, but I'm not supporting this. So this is where we get into the actual thing. So we reject it, but we have to understand crime and social structure. And so if any of you have been wondering, why the heck did I need to have sociology before I took this class? Or I'm thinking particularly some of my criminal justice students. If you were wondering, this is why. Crime itself and criminal justice is a fairly straightforward thing, but I've talked about it many times before. Criminal justice is a social science. It's not a hard science like biology, I almost said philosophy, physics. it's not a hard science, it's a social science. It's something that's related to how humans operate, not chemically or electronically, but how we operate as sentient human beings. This is philosophy, this is psychology, this is humanity. This is all the weird little things that are hard to explain. And so when we are trying to understand what the data shows and how we understand that there is a higher rate of African Americans who commit violent crimes than non African American, why? You don't just accept that, again, to quote racist beliefs, black people cause more crime. No, that's not it. It's understanding how crime is connected to social structures and how it's related to humanity as a whole. And so the text does a really good job of breaking down into these individual sections. I'm not a sociologist. I am simply a college professor who has taken several classes in this kind of stuff, but I also have a master's in criminal justice, in English, and in education. Those are the areas I am qualified to talk in. So I will talk about this in sociology terms, but I am not the expert on it. I will talk about it from the criminal justice standpoint and from the English humanities teaching aspect. And so, I would argue any good criminal justice student should understand how crime and social structure work. And so, one of the first big things is social disorganization theory. And it really just comes down to we see crime rates increase in neighborhoods that have higher rates of poverty, divorce, residential mobility. And that just means that people are coming in and out. There's not a whole lot of community within that area. Lots of people moving in and then moving out in large swaths. So we see weak community supervision, and that's in particular of adolescents, so kids are just kind of doing whatever the heck they want, and low levels of participation in voluntary organizations. There aren't social bonds in these areas. These are very much you're on your own. And so when we consider social disorganization theory, when we try to understand crime and social structure, crime thrives in chaos. Crime thrives in areas where there is not organization. It wants disorganization. And so that's one of the key points of criminal justice and social work in particular, and sociology and psychology. It's the idea that if there is not proper support, and if it is a house of cards that has no tape or glue and it is just cards by themselves, it's easy to fall apart. And crime thrives in those situations. And that leads us to our first square on the right. We started with social disorganization theory. It's important to note I chose this visual because they're all important. They all play together to understand how crime and social structure work together. So one is not more important than the other. One does not lead to the other, but they are interconnected. And so we need to talk about, as far as social disorganization theory goes, and like I said, how we look at this further, poverty and inequality, and then we're also looking at children development. If you remember when I started talking about white privilege last week, or the week before, oh gosh, I don't remember now, I mentioned that the great equalizer is poverty. You can't avoid it. That is why I said it. It was going to be coming up, but I couldn't just say, hey, everyone, we're going to be talking about it next week. No, it had to be, you got there. Poverty and inequality is one of the biggest things with social disorganization and with understanding why our crime statistics show higher rates of crime for people of color than they do for whites. And that's typically because the data shows us that, traditionally speaking, individuals of color, specifically in the African American community, the Latinx community, and the Native American community, that there are extremely high rates of poverty. Most of these individuals live in impoverished areas, in areas that have high crime rates, have fairly high divorce rates. Um, the data shows us that these are places, these are areas where where children are growing up, and there is inequality, there is racism, there is no care or concern, there is no community watching and making sure you're safe. And on top of that, when we talk about childhood development, children are highly susceptible to external factors. Their minds are still growing, their bodies are still growing. If not saying that single parent children are going to be involved in crime in some way, shape, or form, but statistically speaking, children from a single parent household are at a higher risk of committing a crime. And we see this happen fairly frequently within communities of color because either parents are involved with some kind of criminal behavior and so one is out of the picture, or any other number of factors. Poverty and inequality have a direct impact on childhood development, and all of those things combined play a huge role in the potential of leading to crime. And when you are born into poverty in an unequal society, you are going to be raised to see that inequality. You're going to be raised to recognize this, and your external factors, your neighborhood, your friend circle, the school you go to, all of these things could directly impact the future of your life, where you go, who you interact with, what you do. And so when you start disadvantaged, the chances of you passing the finish line as a winner is not very high. It's not impossible, but it's not easy. And so, again, poverty is the great equalizer. Um, this is where I could say, if you've had me in an FYE class or something before, you probably know this. But a little bit about me. I grew up on the Lower East Side of Erie. I literally grew up 3 blocks away from the old East High, right off of East Lake Road. Um, my mother was a single mother who raised me, and she worked 2.5, 3 jobs most times throughout most of my childhood. I didn't see a whole lot of my mother, and lived in an isolated neighborhood where there was only one elderly woman who lived right next door. The rest were not great houses. We had what I know as an adult was a drug house across the street from where I lived. That house was frequently raided by police, roughly once every 3 to 4 weeks. And there was always someone getting arrested, and there were always people coming in and out of that house. And so I was an individual, despite being a white male in America, I was a poor white kid. I grew up in poverty. Um, my mother did everything she could and uh, got me into a decent private school, but I was unequal there. I was the poor kid at school. Um, it affected me in a very serious way. There's a reason I'm a teacher. There's a reason I'm a teacher that teaches this stuff. Like, these are things that are important to me just as much as they are to some of you. I can't speak for how the people that I've known throughout my life who are of different backgrounds, how they managed, but I did pretty dang good. I would think. But based off of a lot of the data that we have for specifically social disorganization, for poverty, inequality, childhood development, single parent. Um, I was a high risk kid to commit crime and to be seriously involved. If it wasn't for my laziness, I think I would have been in trouble. That's my own joke about it. But in all seriousness, my situation is different than some people. I'm not everyone's, but everyone experiences life differently. And what I'm saying is that while I cannot speak for an individual who has faced systemic racism because I'm not of a race that is picked on, um, know that when I talk about social disorganization, I am speaking from a place of actual experience with that. Anyway, related to this poverty and inequality is our light green square on the bottom left, or not light, but a brighter green. Physical neighborhood characteristics. Again, this goes with social disorganization, inequality, all this. How the neighborhood looks, as well as the types of people that are there. That's also a physical contribution and characteristic of the neighborhood. Lighting, police presence, all of these, so many multi-factored issues that play into it have a direct effect. If you have a high police presence in a neighborhood, well, there's going to be a direct impact on how that particular social group, that neighborhood views police. They might view them positively or they might view them very negatively. Um, it really, it's why we say it's complicated. This is not something that's just, oh, we can say this thing caused that and boom, we're done. No, it's part of the reason why typically what we see, and I'm not saying this is true for everyone, but typically this is why we see that most racist ideation and explanations for these things. Remember how I said we reject the racist explanations? A lot of the time, the reason people latch onto those racist explanations is because it's easy, it's simple. This is complex and complicated. This is, you have to think about 8 million factors and you have to recognize all these other things. Whereas the racist explanation is one to one. Okay, I'm done. I don't need to think anymore. This is complicated. So, part of social disorganization theory, there's a separate piece called broken windows theory. It's part of social disorganization. It's the idea that if a neighborhood looks run down, if a property has overgrown grass, broken windows, things like that, it encourages criminal behavior because it means that nobody cares. So you can get away with crime there, which then, of course, becomes a self fulfilling prophecy because, oh, looks like I can commit crime, I'll commit crime there. And then crime gets committed, and then it becomes the norm. And so then it's supported that, hey, bad looking property equals crime. It's a whole complicated thing, but physical characteristics of a neighborhood, they do matter. The makeup of a neighborhood matters. Do you have a bunch of church going individuals who every Sunday all walk to the church 2 blocks away and has a really tight knit community? Or do you have a group of people that never say hi, never leave their house? Like, those things matter. And of course, the last square bubble on this is what I would say is the most complicated one of these 4 squares here. And that's racial mistreatment, perceptions of injustice, and criminal behavior. So, understanding how social structure matters in regards to crime, we need to understand that there is, and this goes back to that, there is a thing as white privilege, there is a thing as racial mistreatment. Again, I said it as a white person, I don't know what it's like to be have a prejudice put against me just because of the color of my skin. I don't have that experience, but I know that it's a real thing. it's the most white savior thing I could ever say, and I do not mean it as a white savior thing. One of my longest relationships was with a woman of color. She was half black. Her mother was white. Her father was black. Her mother's family was extremely racist, and why she's the only daughter that had a black father. Anyway, she got a lot of racial mistreatment. In the 3.5 years that I was with her, I saw her get routinely uh, random screened for bombs at an airport. I saw her several times get asked by a police officer if they were in the right area, things of that nature. Even though she was with me, they still asked the question. There was a lot of weird things that I saw that were directed because she was a woman of color, and that was not okay. So I do recognize, and I know it's a real thing, but it's something that, again, I have to say I have not experienced myself as a person. But understanding that that is a reality for a lot of people of color, and the way that we just generally perceive injustice in this country also matters. So this book was written before 2020. So we don't have the benefit of text written about the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests throughout the summer. But it's important to note that perceptions of injustice are important. We do see a higher upswing of, at least now in the last 3 to 4 years, we've seen it, a higher understanding or a higher representation that there is injustice within the criminal justice system, that black individuals are targeted more often by police officers than white individuals are. So because we see that injustice and we perceive it as such a problem, that plays into the social structure of how society views it. So now we're viewing police officers as predominantly terrible, terrible, terrible things, and black people are victims. Well, yes, this is a true statement, and we see this in the data. At the same time, this is having wider implications and effects on social structure in general. And then criminal behavior, this is where it all comes back together. All of these things combined and individual criminal behavior in general leads to understanding why social structure has an influence on crime. If you live in a bad area, it's not tightly knit, nobody cares, things are bad, you're mistreated based off of your race, and the public perception out there is that black people commit crime, and you are a young black individual, you might commit crime. And even if you do and you weren't thinking about it and you get in trouble, you're just another statistic part. And that leads to this continuing cycle of validating an invalid belief. And so hopefully that made sense, all of this that I'm kind of talking about. But truly the biggest takeaway I'm hoping you get from this part of the lecture, this slide right here, everything I've talked about, is that crime and understanding the crime data that we have is not just because of one thing, but it's because of the way our social networks, our society, our individual groups that are around us, that has a direct impact on how we operate, how we may or may not commit crime. And so now we get to talk about and shift focuses to something a little bit differently. And that's urban life and the code of the streets. Oy. I don't mean to just do that, but so with what we talked about with specifically poverty and inequality, childhood development, physical neighborhood characteristics, urban life is full of that, and that's partly because of how cities and urban populations and cost of living have an impact on each other. Urban life is that inner city kind of life. It's not the you live out in the suburbs or you live out just out on the country road. No, these are you're in the heart of the city. So there's first off a lot of noise, a lot of life going on, and urban life itself. If you are in the middle of a city, there's not necessarily a great place for community gathering. At least not unless there's a spot nearby you can. And so with urban life, it's the you live by the streets, you die by the streets. Um, the code of the streets is what we refer to as several different things, but it's a way to survive in these particular areas or circumstances. And I don't remember if it's from the text itself or one of the outside readings that I gave you for this week. But there is a comment about the code of the streets, and it's that it's not a poisonous way of thinking or a terrible way of operating. It is for survival. The code of the streets is you don't trust outsiders, you don't trust the police, you don't report crimes, you deal with it in house. It's our problem, we deal with it. Um, but part of the reason the code of the streets exists is because it's in these neighborhoods where there isn't a whole lot of community, and so it is a how to survive in this situation kind of belief structure. And so, because of that, this does play a direct role into how this data comes to be. When you have individuals of color who are in these not great neighborhoods who living very central city wise and in very very urban areas, they live by the code of you don't snitch, you don't tell on someone, you deal with it yourself or you deal with it with your group, because outsiders don't do anything but cause more trouble. So you handle it yourself. The code of the streets, it's how you survive. If you tell on someone who beat your butt, you could wind up dead. You end up worse than what you did. Rather than, I just fought back against them. All right, they left me alone. I told this individual, now I'm killed. It is a very unfortunate and violent system. But the code of the streets is something that needs to be addressed. Our text does talk about it, but like I said, I also know that I did provide um, gosh, an outside reading about this. But something that I do want to talk about briefly, that's not on the slide or anything, but is something that's related to all this, and I just kind of wanted to talk about specifically urban life and the code of the streets. The On page 62, if you're wondering where I am in the textbook and talking about all this postscript, why racial differences in criminal behavior are not stronger, it comes down to Robert Agnew, 2016, the American Society of Criminology. Agnew's a big name in criminology stuff, but just trying to figure out why the heck Agnew recognized that there were a lot of issues that African Americans typically dealt with, specifically urbanization, where they lived, prejudice they faced. Like, recognize that all these things had a direct impact, but the question was, why isn't it significantly higher? Why do we still see this 99% of African Americans don't commit crime? If what we see is true, if all of these factors lead to a higher percentage of committing crime. And we see a large percentage of African Americans represented in crime, but we see that part of that population is only like a percent. How the heck does that work? Why isn't it like 80% of all African Americans commit crime? And so Agnew ends up finding that what ends up happening is that there are four groups of protective factors that African American families and communities tend to build. And surprisingly, yeah, some of it is code of the street stuff, but some of it is just, general kind of additional things. And some of these, some people might know. But so the four groups are what Agnew called the four S's. It's skills in coping, strengths in the face of adversity, social supports, and social controls. Um, so skills in coping, uh, this is page 63, by the way. So skills in coping, African Americans, this is direct quote, African Americans learn from an early age that they will be treated negatively because of racial discrimination. They thus attribute any mistreatment they experience to discrimination rather than their own shortcomings. This response may help maintain their self esteem and so reduce their chances of committing crime. African American children also learn from their parents and other people how to avoid the influence of any chronic gang offenders in their neighborhoods. These and other coping mechanisms help keep African American youths from becoming involved in crime. If you note, it talks about having family and being in a decent place. So it supports this whole idea. But coping skills is something that's really important in anyone, especially in children as they grow up. Coping with defeat, coping with loss, how to appropriately handle victory. A lot of these things people don't necessarily learn, and they're important things. But coping is an important skill, especially for adversity and loss. These are things that all humans feel, we all deal with, and it's not easy. But the idea that within the African American community, there is this strong push from an early age of what life is going to be like. Um, so again, Agnew found that the skills in coping are instilled from a very young age. Strengths in the face of adversity. It's the whole, no matter what happens, no matter how bad things get, we will survive. We will overcome. Oh my gosh, Maya Angelou, I Will Rise. It's a great poem. I will try to remember to put a link to it. I actually will write it down right now as I'm recording this. Um, sorry. That was one of those, my brain thought of it. It's not something I wrote down in my notes to talk about, but it popped up. Um, the idea that no matter how bad things get, that you continue to push forward and go through. This is a skill that, again, rather than say again, let's do it this way. All four of these skills that Agnew found were strong in African American communities are all four really great skills or uh, groups that everyone should have because these are very positive and useful tools for being good people. So skills and coping, but strengths in the face of adversity to be able to go, you know what? Yeah, this is a problem, but I'm not going to let it get me down. That's a big deal. Social supports, it's not just having it's not just having blood family. Um, for my predominantly uh, white individuals, you may not have a great understanding of this. I know some people do, not everyone does, but the idea that your family is not just those who are blood, but it's the people that are around you, your closest friends, the people who are part of your life. Um, it's non family individuals who fulfill familial roles. I know in several other cultures there are concepts like aunties. They're not actually your aunt, but they act like your aunt or your mother when they see you. Like, these are actual things that other cultures do. Like I said, generally white population doesn't do a whole lot of, but some do. It's a weird thing. Um, but the idea that you have social support, you're not alone. When you have a community, you're not alone. And when you're not alone, you don't get necessarily pulled into crime. Yes, if your community is crime based, you're going to get pulled in, but typically a positive group influence will prevent it from happening. And then social controls, really, it's social control is both self control, but it's also understanding that you are in control of your own actions, your own being. So, a lot of individuals, specifically that Agnew noted in the African American community, was a strong moral sense of what's right and wrong. You do the right thing. Um, you get in a fight not because you want to beat someone up, but you get in a fight to protect someone. You get in a fight to uh, stop someone from doing something, and so that's the whole idea of what Agnew was talking about there. And so that is urban life in the code of the streets. Um, there's more to the code of the streets, and I'm going to talk about it in just a second, but I want to take a brief moment to just kind of talk about the last little section of the chapter. Page 64, white collar crime, race, and criminal offending revisited. Just noted by the book as well. We talked about it in chapter 1 of the textbook, but we see the disproportionate levels of criminal violent offenses and property offenses in African Americans. But when we see all offenses, there's a huge percentage of white individuals. But also, when you look at white collar crime, which is part of the all offenses that is dominated by white individuals, this shows a disparity in how the data is shown, that kind of thing. So it's just the book brings it up again here when we looked at the statistics of crime rates, just because it's important to note that significantly more white people commit white collar crime. Okay, code of the streets. Going back to this in urban life, one serious issue that the book doesn't really get into, but it is something that is important, and why I say the outside readings this week are closely related to this. The code of the streets is, as I said, a necessity of life in a lot of cases, but it's also been highly glorified. And I wanted to wait until I talked about everything else before I talked about this. So apologies for kind of coming back to it later. But you'll understand why. The glorification of the gangster life, the thug life, that kind of thing, has led to this code of the streets problem, and why we see a disproportionately high number of black youth being represented in crime. What we see is that movies, television, rap music, and I know I sound like a boomer saying that, but there are rap songs that glorify, and hip hop that glorify being a drug dealer, being a criminal, having a rap sheet, doing these things that are criminal activities. By glorifying it, we are encouraging individuals who engage in that media to believe that that is the path to success, the path to freedom. And so the code of the streets becomes so entrenched in what we do and how we operate that that is the goal. That is the dream. One of the things I'm having you read this week is an article from Niagara. It's between Niagara, New York. So it's about Toronto and Niagara in particular, how individuals in that community, young kids, technically the youngest was 17, but they're 18, 19, 20. Individuals who are in trouble. This is from just December of 2022. So this is real recent. They're individuals who were in trouble for trying to illegally sell fentanyl in Niagara from Toronto. And none of the kids have a dependency issue. None of them have a deep connection to like drug use. They really wanted to live the life of a drug dealer because it's been glorified that that's the way to do it. You don't go Walter White and make your meth. You take a different approach. You sell this to the other people, and they were quoted as saying we did it for the glory, and the money. Like, okay, this is glorifying this kind of lifestyle, and this leads to this misrepresentation. So it's just important to kind of talk about that. So you'll see that in the readings for this week that there are some very specified and specific readings. They're related to this kind of code of the streets and urban life section. It's why I didn't have so much about this, is because I want you to do those outside readings, because it's going to be really what the discussion board is looking at is some of that stuff. But anyway, thank you very much. That wraps up this lecture video. See, we're at the last slide. So thank you very much, and I'll talk to y'all soon.